Well, hello. These are my notes for week 6. This week, feminism is up to the plate. The last time we looked at some feminist texts, I mentioned how the trend in the field was towards an ever more complicated view of what exactly the idea of gender differences might mean. So let's get started with those complications. We begin with our editor's notes from Feminist Paradigms Gender Effects. As last time, I'm not going to provide a bunch of specific overviews of this development of feminist criticism. Rivkin and Ryan are pretty concise in what they say. I will point out that much of what they say is exactly in line with what we've already covered. They begin by addressing the primary division in feminist theory, and that's whether everything rests on biology or whether everything rests on culture. In simple terms, is it nature or nurture? As they discuss this divide, our editors point out how trends in other types of criticism have influenced and altered feminist criticism. Way back in my first notes for week 1, you may remember me saying how crazily connected all of these different theories seem from my perspective. The reason for this is because they're not so different. They're all connected. So Rivkin and Ryan describe how second and third wave feminism, social and political movements set in a historical time and place, evolved as it incorporated perspectives from other lenses. The psychoanalytical served as a basis for a lot of this. In the 60s and 70s, we had women like Luce Irigaray, Nancy Chodorow, and Julia Kristeva, who were trained psychiatrists and used their clinical backgrounds to talk about gender inequalities. The focus remains on women in their work, but the methods develop from another lens entirely. Rivkin and Ryan tell us that the same thing happened when Marxism was considered, that some women, and this is a quote from them, noted that much of what the essentialists took to be signs of a good female nature were in fact attributes assigned women in capitalist culture. And again, in the period of post-structuralism, the idea of language games becomes a politically shaded tool when it becomes a premise that the language we speak automatically represents gendered biases. Different lenses can be used in combination to strengthen any other lens that you care to choose as your primary one. The editors continue their observations to discuss how feminism itself engendered, if I can use that word, other lenses that look at the bigger picture of sex, sexuality, and gender with reference to things other than the male-female binary. Our readings this week, in fact, tend to focus on a set of feminist theorists who want to show you how to look beyond these categorical boundaries. So we begin with Judith Butler and Imitation and Gender Insubordination. This segment of Butler gives a great intersection of what I was just talking about. We can clearly see how the psychoanalytical lens is a useful tool for Butler as she engages her argument. However, we can also see that her argument is aimed at something which does not quite line up with some of the expectations for feminism that we've already established. Butler is actually ground zero for an entirely different lens, usually accorded its own label as performative theory. Before I go much further, let me say that as with some of our other selections by our editors, I think this is a rather unfortunate one. I'm not going to lie, Butler can get dense and she can be difficult, but that is not really the defining characteristic of her work, in my experience anyway. To have you start off with her by reading several pages of logical argumentation is probably not the fairest thing to her or, for you. So let's get to talking about what Butler means by performance. Essentially, this all comes down to that nature-nurture thing, something that has actually been troubling feminist theory for decades by the time Butler comes along. Early feminists like Cixous really wanted to say that women are inherently different, and they did say it. They said that all of civilization had conspired to keep women from doing and saying what women would, favoring instead discourse favoring instead the discourse of the male. The subtext of this is that the biology of women gives them a different perspective. Butler, however, counters that women are inherently women in the way that culture constructs them through that specific categorization. More, she says that men are in exactly the same position. We learn how to fill the role that society presents us, and since society has different roles depending on biological gender, we learn to identify ourselves according to the requirements set out for us. On page 957, she writes, "Gender is not a performance that a prior subject elects to do, but gender is performance in the sense that it constitutes as an effect the very subject it appears to express. To the individual, it seems like he or she is just being him or herself. However, the hegemony that society holds over the individual imposes a set of rules informing the individual what to do, how to act like he or she should. Because everyone around is doing the same thing, and because society tends to enforce normality as a given standard, the actor remains unaware that what he or she is doing is an act. So, for instance, when I stand in front of a classroom, I regularly take for granted how my age, old, and my gender, a dude, will impart a sense of authority that helps keep an ordered room without my really having to do anything about it. I know for a fact that my younger female colleagues must regularly take direct actions to keep the same degree of order. Both of us are victims of our societal attitudes towards gender, and usually we do not even think about how these attitudes are shaping our reactions. If I was an observer in that colleague's classroom, I might note how she struggles to maintain authority, unconsciously comparing her experience to my own, as though they're equal. And in the end, that really wouldn't be fair. What Butler's theorizing requires us to do is to consider ourselves separately from our gender, to think in terms of identity that do not have to do with the way we engage each other socially through roles which are inherently gendered. This means that she asks us to separate our identity from that of father, mother, son, daughter, and outward, on out to male friend versus female friend. Anytime we include a gendered element, we are to keep in mind that it is purely a construction which is specific to our society, not something which is natural to humanity. On page 958, Butler says, there is no direct expressive or causal line there are no direct expressive or causal lines between sex, gender, gender representations, sexual practice, fantasy, and sexuality. Each of these elements of our lives do what they do as expressions of themselves and as expressions of what we are taught we ought to be. At the end of the article, Butler turns to the topic of mimesis, how we inherently learn by a monkey see, monkey do method. Her point is that we are all influenced by people of varying genders throughout our lives. What we do as we negotiate socially is either knowingly or subconsciously mimicking those that we're close to. This happens irrespective to gender difference, so we are regularly incorporating the words, actions, or beliefs of others into ourselves. Each of those involved, the model and the copycat, each probably has a gender identity, but it does not enter into this exchange. Regardless, the fact remains that we are all regularly incorporating elements of the opposite gender into ourselves while we maintain the facade of being purely masculine or purely feminine. On page 960, Butler talks directly about Freud and how he thought this kind of incorporation of another works in relation to personal identity. Freud and Butler favor talking about this happening through an actual loss, a moment when the self recognizes the absence of another and tries to replicate its presence through representation within the self. In a broader sense, we can see that this is largely part of what Lacan talks about happening in the mirror stage. We move to Gruhl and Kaplan and global identities. And these two authors move us from the psychoanalytical application of feminism directly towards a more deconstructive approach. This interesting article suggests considering sexual identity in terms of trends in globalization. The authors would like to apply the term transnational to the field rather than global. They note that the term globalization has an understood valence, meaning that it is looking at the economic hegemony of Western culture over the rest of the world. When we think in global terms, we are automatically thinking unilaterally, a single vision or version of any element. So Gruhl and Kaplan suggest transnational as a more flexible term. So right away, they point to the issues with the choice of terms, and this is classic deconstruction, tearing meaning apart and showing its complex nature, even in a single word. The authors say transnational is already used in several ways in several fields. It may indicate movements of people across political borders, the dissolution of national borders as a significant concept, diaspora, where movements of people across borders are considered in a cultural view, movements of capital in a predatory colonialist method, and NGO-fueled awareness of social movements. The next problem Gruhl and Kaplan bring up is that sexuality is not its own disciplinary study. Instead, it's addressed through numerous disciplines, and each of these considers sexuality to be just a subfactor in its view. And a further subfactor for the study of sexuality is that it has not been one that we're comfortable with historically. This complicates the issue, but the issue is already pretty complicated by the assumptions we bring when we do start talking about it. And these assumptions include the gender binary. We anticipate that it is normal to look for men and women and not any further. We don't look to define it in any other way. We also assume that family is an essential base for our ideas about society, and we consider this basic unit where identity formation occurs as being, essential. So again, we don't think about what it actually makes a family in different cultures. There's also egocentrism. When we think globally, we tend to lump together what we're familiar with as us, and we put it in opposition to what we don't know, which is them. When we do this, we look at standard political boundaries to build the case for us and them. And political boundaries really have very little to do with variations in culture. There's other problems with egocentrism. We like to think of the way we do things as the right way. This invariably means that others who do otherwise are wrong. And then there's just the general adherence to binaries. When we start trying to think in global terms, we're always opposing global to local, as though the interests of either are always mutually exclusive. This pattern of thinking about binaries is at the root of the author's point, because everything is much more complex than just thinking in terms of straight versus gay or oppressed versus free. Gruhl and Kaplan conclude with a call for a new conceptualization focused on the subject of sexual identity. And when they do this, you can see a parallel between what they're doing and what we've seen before in Cixous and her call for feminine discourse. Our authors write, sexual subjects are produced not just by the politics of identity or social movements, but by the links between various institutions that accompany these social movements. They want an approach to sexual identity which recognizes that the topic is more far-reaching than the personal nature of it would seem to indicate. In their wrap-up, Gruhl and Kaplan very neatly revisit each of the variations that transnational can mean and apply it to specific instances of gender identification, showing, in the end, the versatility of their selected term. And we conclude this week with one of my favorite critics, and that's Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick and her Epistemology of the Closet. I trust that you find Sedgwick as readable as I do. This article is part of the introduction to her book of the same name from 1990. She begins with much the same point that Gruhl and Kaplan make. We are extremely varied as sexual beings, but we always seem to want to bring the discussion down to binaries. The primary one Sedgwick concerns herself with is that between hetero and homosexuality. So, Sedgwick takes an overtly deconstructive point of view, breaking down categories and interrogating their real meaning. One of the most important things she points out is that this intellectual exercise does not exercise, in the sense of eliminating, the power that is inherent in the systems that support and are supported by the binary views. Structures of power in both a political and social sense are tied to such categorizations. That is why such categorizations came into being and why they continue to exist despite opposition. In this, she follows the work of Michel Foucault, especially as he voiced it in his History of Sexuality, and that's from 1976. Foucault traces how the control of sexuality was previously accomplished entirely through social means, but how that became overtly political through legislating acceptable sexual practices during the Victorian era. What he is clear about, though, is that as people work together, there is always some control imposed by the group upon the individual, and this has to be viewed as an expression of power. Sedgwick breaks down her terms: sex, gender, and sexuality. Sex: differences expressed through biology, the XX versus the XY in our chromosomes. Gender, and she says this is the social production and reproduction of male and female identities and behaviors. That's a quote. Lastly, sexuality. This is simply the practically indefinable range of physical, emotional, and psychic expectations, acts, and desires that also go into constituting our sense of identity. Sedgwick notes how interconnected these terms are. And that makes it nearly impossible to discuss one without the other. Her recommendation is that gender and sexuality simply be regarded as independent though overlapping concepts. The only way to accomplish this is to forget broad categories applying to many individuals, like the class of heterosexual versus the class of homosexual. Instead, she says that what we should do is always speak in the specific. Our aim, then, would be to consider gender and sexuality where every issue of gender would necessarily be embodied through the specificity of a particular sexuality and vice versa. And that's a quote from her again. Working as a feminist, Sedgwick closes our section by justifying her work in an area that actually excludes women, as Sedgwick wrote almost exclusively about male homosexuality. I think her arguments are interesting. She talks about the development of feminism as a pattern of thinking that has grown ever more complex in its inclusion of looking at the ways in which women are oppressed. The result is a realization that not all oppressions are congruent. Another quote. Sedgwick suggests that her work is appropriate in two ways, as, for thinking of it as feminist criticism. First, it extends the man-woman binary to include the man-not-man binary, and that's if we consider either the heterosexual or the homosexual male as an embodiment of what masculinity should be. It also allows the potential to shed light on new facets of the oppression of women by looking at how others have been oppressed by the same dominant social force. So, Like I say, a lot of this takes us what looks like it's a very long way away from feminism as we think of it in a general sense. But I think you'll see that these are all logical extensions where we're thinking about using feminism in new and different ways that still take advantage of those original ideas. This week, we're looking at two readings that have quite a degree of gravitas in relation to feminist theory, short works by Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Kate Chopin. You're to read one and offer an analysis using some of this new information about what feminist and gender theory can show us about them. I'm glad, as always, to chat with you, and if you need any further clarification or just need a chat, here I am. Till next week, adios.